The history of Fairbanks, the second largest city in Alaska, can be traced to the founding of a trading post by E.T.Barnette on the south bank of the Chena River on August 26, 1901. The area had seen human occupation since at least the last ice age, but a permanent settlement was not established at the site of Fairbanks until the 20th century. The discovery of gold near Barnette's trading post caused him to turn what had been a temporary stop into a permanent one. The gold caused a stampede of miners to the area, and buildings sprang up around Barnette's trading post. In November 1903, the area's residents voted to incorporate the city of Fairbanks. Barnette became the city's first mayor, and the city flourished as thousands of people came in search of gold during the Fairbanks Gold Rush. By the time of World War I, the easy-to-reach gold was exhausted and Fairbanks' population plunged as miners moved to promising finds at Ruby and Iditarod. Construction of the Alaska Railroad caused a surge of economic activity and allowed heavy equipment to be brought in for further exploitation of Fairbanks gold deposits. Enormous gold dredgers were built north of Fairbanks, and the city grew throughout the 1930s as the price of gold rose during the Great Depression. A further boom came during the 1940s and 1950s as the city became a staging area for construction of military depots during World War II and the first decade of the Cold War. In 1968, the vast Prudhoe Bay oil field was discovered in Alaska's North Slope. Fairbanks became a supply point for exploitation of the oil field and for construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline system, which caused a boom unseen since the first years of Fairbanks' founding and helped the town recover from the devastating 1967 Fairbanks flood. Fairbanks became a government center in the late 1960s with the establishment of the Fairbanks North Star Borough, which took Fairbanks as its borough seat. A drop in oil prices during the 1980s caused a recession in the Fairbanks area, but the city gradually recovered as oil prices climbed during the 1990s. Tourism also became an important factor in Fairbanks' economy, and the growth of the tourism industry in the city continues even as oil production declines. Before Fairbanks, though there was never a permanent Alaska Native settlement at the site of Fairbanks, Athabascan Indians have used the area for thousands of years. An archaeological site excavated on the grounds of the University of Alaska Fairbanks uncovered a native camp about 3,500 years old. From evidence gathered at the site, archaeologists surmise that native activities in the area were limited to seasonal hunting and fishing. In addition, archaeological sites on the grounds of nearby Fort Wainwright date back 10,000 years. Sites within Alaska but away from Fairbanks date to the time of the Bering Land Bridge more than 13,000 years ago. Arrowheads excavated from the University of Alaska Fairbanks site matched similar items found in Asia, providing some of the first evidence that humans arrived in North America via the land bridge. The first recorded exploration of the Tanana Valley and the Tanana River did not take place until 1885, but historians believe Russian traders from Nulato and Hudson's Bay Company traders ventured into the lower reaches of the Tanana and possibly the Chena River in the middle of the 19th century. In 1885, Henry Truman Allen of the U.S. Army led the first recorded expedition down the length of the Tanana River, charting the Chena River's mouth along the way. In July 1897, the first news of the Klondike Gold Strike reached Seattle, Washington, triggering the Klondike Gold Rush. Thousands of people boarded steamships heading north to the gold fields. Some of these travelers sailed around the western tip of Alaska and up the Yukon River to Dawson City rather than take an arduous overland trip across the Boundary Ranges. One of these adventurers was E.T.Barnette, who intended to establish a trading post at Tanacross, Alaska, where the Valdez-Eagle Trail crossed the Chena River. He hired the steamer Lavelle Young to transport him and his supplies, and they began the trip upriver in August 1901. After turning into the Chena from the Yukon, the steamboat ran into low water. After venturing upstream several miles, the boat reached an impassable point. Barnette suggested the Chena River might be a slough of the Chena and a way around the low water. About 15 miles from the mouth of the Chena, the Lavelle Young again ran into an impassable stretch of river. The captain of the Young did not want to travel downstream with a heavy load because of the danger posed by the extra mass. He therefore unloaded Barnette's cargo in August 26, 1901, with an irate Barnette assisting. Barnette began building a cabinet of site he named Chena City, and he sold supplies to two prospectors, Felix Pedro and Tom Gilmore, who were in the area. Barnette traded for furs, then traveled to Valdez via dog team with his wife and 3 other men. The mountain pass they traveled through was later named Isabel Pass in honor of Barnette's wife. From Valdez, he returned to St. Michael, where he built a steamboat, the Isabel, and began sailing up the Yukon in August 1902. He intended to move his supplies to Tanacross, but when he arrived at his trading post on the Chena River, he changed his mind. Felix Pedro had discovered gold. Origins of Fairbanks. Before Barnette traveled upriver with the Isabel, he met Judge James Wickersham in St. Michael. Wickersham was the judge for the federal 3rd Judicial District, which stretched from the North Slope to the Aleutian Islands. Wickersham was impressed with Barnette and his plan to establish a trading post at Tanacross. He suggested Barnette name his settlement Fairbanks, after Charles W. Fairbanks, the senior senator from Indiana. Barnette liked the idea and later said, "If we should ever want aid at the national capital, we would have the friendship, at least, of someone who could help us." Quote, when Barnette heard of Pedro's gold strike, he transferred the name for his planned Tanacross store to the settlement on the Chena River and convinced the people with him to accept the name. When Barnette and the Isabel's crew heard of Pedros Discovery, they immediately fled the boat and the settlement to stake claims on creeks and likely gold-bearing spots 12 miles north, near the mountain and creek Pedro named after himself. Marking a claim was simple. Each man could pick a set amount of space, which was marked with posts at each corner, hence staking the claim. Each claim had to be listed by a federal recorder. When Barnette and the crew of the Isabel were staking claims, Barnette proclaimed himself the interim recorder until an official one could be brought to the area. Although they also recorded the claims with Barnette, most men also reported the claims at the official office in Circle. To maximize his gain, Barnette had power of attorney for several relatives in Ohio. He staked claims in the names, thus giving him authority over a large portion of what was believed to be the gold-bearing terrain. Word of Pedro's discovery spread during the months that followed Barnette's arrival in September 1902. In December, he wrote to a friend in Seattle, "A message came yesterday that 1,000 people had left Nome during the last 3 days for here. I look for half of Dawson here before spring." Quote, in January 1903, Barnette's cook, Jujiro Wada, arrived in Dawson City with word of the gold find. On January 17, 1903, the Yukon Sun newspaper ran the headline, "Rich Strike Made in the Chena," across most of its front page, spurring miners from the Yukon to stampede to Fairbanks in the first big rush of the settlement's history. Boom. When the miners from Nome, Dawson, Rampart, and other places arrived in the Chena Valley, they were disappointed with what they found. Hundreds of claims were staked, but none were close to Pedros' Discovery claims, which had been taken by the crew of the Isabel and other early arrivals. Adding to the pressure on claiming land were men who, like Barnett, had power of attorney rights for others, and could thus make multiple claims. The Dawson Daily News reported that one man claimed 144 portions of 20 acres apiece. Around Barnett's trading post, town lots were claimed for $2.50 apiece, and there was fierce competition for the choicest spots. At the mouth of the Chena River, a competing settlement, named Chena, sprang up when two traders moved the store to the junction of the two rivers. Land speculation was fierce in Chena, where claims were frequently stolen and had to be enforced with firearms. Accounts vary, but historians estimate that by spring 1903, between 700 and 1,000 men arrived in the Tanana Valley. This put an enormous strain on Barnett's stock of food, which rapidly rose in price with demand. Miners objected to Barnett charging $12 per bag of flour and requiring them to buy cases of canned food. They gathered outside his store and demanded he lower his prices or they would burn it down. He responded that he had riflemen inside the building, and both groups reached a compromise. Shortly afterward, Barnett headed south with his wife on a dog team, intending to gather investors to purchase more supplies. In April, Judge Wickersham arrived on a trip looking for a location for the courthouse, jail, and government offices for the 3rd District Courts. He later described his first view of the settlement: a half-dozen new squat log structures, a few tents, a small clearing in the primitive forest that was Fairbanks as I first saw it on April 9, 1903. Wickersham examined Chena as a potential site for the government offices, but he settled on Fairbanks, partially because Barnett's partner and brother-in-law, Frank Cleary, gave Wickersham a choice piece of land valued at between $1,500 and $2,000. Wickersham asked Cleary to name the two main streets in town, Cushman and Lacey, after U.S. Representatives Francis W. Cushman of Washington and John F. Lacey of Iowa. Wickersham estimated 500 people in town, and another count estimated 1,000, with 387 houses under construction, 6 saloons, and no churches. Before spring arrived, Wickersham published the first newspaper in the settlement, the Fairbanks Miner, on a typewriter. It sold 7 copies at $5 per copy. But even as the walls of Wickersham's courthouse were going up, dissatisfied miners were leaving the area. Hundreds left on rafts going down river as steamers going to Dawson City. By June 1903, cabins on city lots were selling for as little as $10. Meanwhile, Barnett sold 2/3 of his store to the Alaska Commercial Company and arranged for the establishment of a post office to his settlement. In fall 1903, the flood of miners leaving the Tanana Valley ended when major gold strikes were made north of Fairbanks. The gold was deeper than in the Klondike, and it had taken time to dig to it. At Cleary Creek, miner Jesse Noble discovered what became the richest vein of gold in Alaska. Gold extraction was slow, because almost no heavy machinery was available to remove the overburden above the layers of gold. The gold discoveries of 1903 reversed the trend of people away from the Tanana Valley. By Christmas 1903, there were between 1,500 and 1,800 miners in the valley. Another food shortage arose during the winter of 1903, alleviated only by the food Barnett had brought in after his trip to the lower 48. Despite the food shortage, more buildings were constructed. The Northern Commercial Company built a store to replace Barnett's cabin, and Wickersham consortium recorded a wide range of businesses, including 500 houses and 1,200 people. To manage the growing population, the settlement held a vote on November 10, 1903 to decide whether to incorporate Fairbanks as a town or not. The vote passed, and Barnette was sworn in as the city's first mayor on the next day. City of Fairbanks. Barnette's first action as mayor was to write a letter to Washington, D.C., asking the federal government to sell its military food stores from posts near the town, thus alleviating the food shortage. This move was followed by others, licensing a telephone company, providing for garbage collection, fire protection, and a one-room school. Barnette used his position to grant long-term contracts for city utilities to members of his family. One of Barnette's brothers-in-law, James W. Hill, was given a 25-year contract to provide electricity, drinking water, and steam heat to the city. In 1904, Barnette arranged for regular shipments of supplies to Fairbanks, and the town continued to expand. In addition to the local telephone system, Fairbanks was connected to the outside world via the Washington-Alaska military cable and telegraph system, which was expanded from Eagle to Nome in 1903 and passed through Fairbanks. Gold production increased from $40,000 in 1903 to $600,000 in 1904 and $6 million in 1905. This expansion and the accompanying rise in population drove further productivity. Barnette opened the town's first bank on September 9, 1904. 1 month earlier, 2 Catholic priests built the town's first church, Immaculate Conception Church. Also in 1904, construction of a railroad began in Fairbanks and Chena, its downstream neighbor. Low water on the Chena River prevented steamboats from reaching Fairbanks, so a railroad line was built from the Chena River at Chena to Fairbanks and the mines north of town. Construction of the Chena Mines Railroad was finished to Fairbanks on July 17, 1905. 2 new banks opened in 1905, as did the city's first greenhouse, and a new $10,000 bridge across the Chena River. In June 1905, the bridge caused the biggest flood in the young city's history when a bridge upstream of it collapsed and the resulting wreckage caught in the bridge and blocked the river's flow. The river rose, flooding the town, and the bridge had to be dynamited to halt the flood. The next year, a fire destroyed most of Fairbanks, and the damage was estimated at $1.5 million. The town was quickly rebuilt, and the town's first hospital, St. Joseph's, was built on the north bank of the Chena. Because the hospital was run by a Catholic religious order, Immaculate Conception Church was later transported across the Chena River and placed next to the hospital. In 1907, Barnette's bank was forced to temporarily close due to the Panic of 1907 and legal troubles. A new school was built, which housed 150 students. Other schools were built on the north side of the Chena River, which was separate from town. In 1908, the U.S. Army Signal Corps built a radio telegraph tower in town, replacing the cable telegraph system to Valdez and Seattle. The 176-feet tower was the tallest structure in town for decades. In 1909, Fairbanks gold production peaked at more than $9.5 million. The town saw its first library opened that year, and the Fairbanks Daily News Miner, the city's longest-lived newspaper, began publishing. Poor investments caused the bank founded by Barnette to fail in January 1911, at a time when it held more than $1 million in deposits from Fairbanks Fairbanks residents. In Fairbanks, the common belief was that Barnette had embezzled money from the bank. Although he was found guilty of only one of 11 charges against him, Barnette had a poor reputation in Fairbanks. For years afterward, Fairbanks newspapers referred to any robbery as Barnetting the subject. The accusations against Barnette were big news in a town that had little crime. Gambling and drinking were common throughout town. Prostitution was restricted to a district separated from the rest of town by a wooden fence. The Line, as it was known, operated until the 1950s with the tacit approval of city authorities. Fights were common, but gunplay was not. As one miner recalled, not more than one man in 500 carried a gun, and while fisticuffs were common, gunfights were not. This was backed up by the experience of Northern Commercial Company stagecoach drivers, who carried more than $7 million overland during a 12-year period without a single incident. Decline. In 1911, the Fairbanks Commercial Club, a group of businesses, created the slogan, "Fairbanks, Alaska's Golden Heart." The slogan remains the city's motto today. In that year, Fairbanks boasted a population of more than 3,500 people, making it the largest city in Alaska. Thousands more people lived in mining camps outside the city itself. But 1910 marked the beginning of a decline in Fairbanks' fortunes. That year, less than $6 million in gold was produced, two-thirds the total of the previous year. By 1911, production was half what it had been in 1909. In 1918, it was 10% of what it had been 9 years before. The decline in production caused businesses to go out of business. Stores that sold to miners closed, as did those that supported the mines directly. World War I caused a further decline as the town's young men were drafted and sent overseas. Economic effects also were felt. A local judge later stated that the war set Fairbanks back by 10 years because it dried up construction and sent men overseas. After the war, the 1918 flu pandemic was particularly virulent in Alaska. It killed between 2,000 and 3,000 people in the territory. By 1923, the Fairbanks Daily News Miner estimated there were fewer than 1,000 people in the city, and almost none at the mining camps beyond town, slowing the decline. Although Fairbanks was in decline, two major projects mitigated the worst effects of the post-gold rush slump: construction of the Alaska Railroad and the creation of the University of Alaska. Alaska Railroad in 1906, L.A. Nadeau of the Northern Pacific Railroad predicted a railroad link to the ocean would allow gold miners to bring in heavy equipment and process large amounts of low-grade ore. Not only will the cost of living be cheaper to the miner, but he will be able to get his heavy machinery at a price low enough to enable him to work a vast quantity of low-grade ground, which cannot be touched under present conditions. 8 years after that remark, the U.S. Congress appropriated $35 million for construction of the Alaska Railroad system. News of the appropriation set off celebrations among Fairbanks residents who hoped its construction would prove a boon for the local economy. In 1917, the Alaska Railroad purchased the Tanana Valley Railroad, which had suffered from the wartime economic problems. The railroad line was extended westward until it reached the town of Nenana and a construction party working north from Ship Creek, later renamed Anchorage. Until the railroad was finished and coal from Healy became available, Fairbanks burned wood as a heating source and to provide electricity. In 1913, the town burned between 12,000 and 14,000 cords of wood, with the Northern Commercial Company burning 8,500 cords alone. President Warren G. Harding visited Fairbanks in 1923 as part of a trip trip to hammer in the ceremonial final spike of the railroad, Tanana. The rail yards of the Tanana Valley Railroad were converted for use by the Alaska Railroad, and Fairbanks became the northern end of the line and its second largest depot. University of Alaska. 1 year before Harding's visit to Fairbanks, the Alaska Agricultural College and School of Mines opened its doors to 6 students. The school was thought up by James Wickersham, who had risen to become Alaska's delegate to Congress. In 1915, Wickersham gained approval of a bill funding the college from the 63rd United States Congress. After the bill was approved, he traveled to Fairbanks and selected a site on a hill 4 miles west of Fairbanks, in what is today College, Alaska, which is now often referred to as part of Fairbanks, and not as a separate entity. On July 4, 1915, acting without the authority of law, he laid the cornerstone for the school. The site for the school was directly north of the U.S. Agricultural Experimental Station, an experimental farm created by Charles Christian Georgeson in 1907. The farm was a project by the U.S. Department of Agriculture to explore the agricultural potential of interior Alaska. By 1916, 1 year after the founding of the University of Alaska, the experimental farm employed 20 people. As mining declined in the Fairbanks area, some miners turned to homesteading. Under the Homestead Act, many miners applied for grants of land from the federal government and established farms around the city. A 1919 survey by the U.S. Geological Survey identified 94 homesteads within 6 miles of Fairbanks. Also listed were 2 tungsten mills and 16 gold mills. Agriculture in the area was spurred by food and fodder shortages during the winters of 1913, 1915, and 1916. Fairbanks businessmen also encouraged the growth of farming. Wickersham provided more funding for the experimental farm. The Tanana Valley Railroad provided free grain seed acquired from an experimental farm in Sweden, and William Fentress Thompson, editor of the Fairbanks Daily News Miner, wrote frequent editorials in favor of more farming. Prominent Fairbanks businessmen formed the Alaska Loyal League, a group that encouraged farming. Farmers also created the Tanana Valley State Fair in 1924 to demonstrate their agricultural success. It is Alaska's oldest state fair and still operates today. Despite these moves, the agriculture movement in Fairbanks had only limited success. A farmers' bank established in 1917 to provide loans for equipment purchases went out of business 2 years later, and although the Alaska Railroad allowed for cheaper shipment of tractors and other agricultural equipment, it also permitted a steady supply of food shipments to Fairbanks. In 1929, Alaska farms met only about 10% of the state's food demand. By 1931, the University of Alaska had grown to the point that the experimental farm was annexed by the school.